Chapter 9 is dental pulp. Dental pulp is soft connective tissue that's located in the central portion of each tooth. It is a specialized connective tissue and it contains blood vessels, nerves, as well as the nerve endings within the dentin. Each pulp opens into the tissue that surrounds the tooth through the apex of the root canal. The anatomy of the pulp is shown in this image. You can see the coronal pulp, which is in the crown under the dentin, and the radicular pulp. Radicular means root, so you can see the pulp chambers that run down through the root. And then the apical, foramina, and accessory canals. Those allow the tooth to communicate with the periodontal tissues like the periodontal ligament. Humans have 52 pulps, providing that they have all of their permanent teeth and primary teeth. So every tooth has its own pulp. All pulps have a soft gelatinous consistency in their pulp chambers surrounded by dentin. So dentin's job is kind of to protect that pulp. Pulps of the molar teeth are approximately 4 times larger than the pulp that we see in the incisors. And something to think about is as we age, if you look at A, you can see how large that pulp chamber is and how vital and how many nutrient canals and nerve tracts and everything that we see there. As we get older, you can see that the amount of dentin gets greater. You could also look at the cusp tips and see that the tooth is wearing down. Because of that, if you look at D, down at the cementum covering the root, you can see that it is greater because cementum is the one mineral that lays down all of our lives. So as we lose occlusal height, that tooth is constantly laying down cementum because it wants to stay in occlusion with the opposing dentition. You can see that the pulp chamber becomes smaller. So that's kind of what happens as we age. Coronal pulp occupies the crown of the tooth, and it will usually follow the contour of the outer surface of the crown. The pulp horns, where the coronal pulp goes up to a point, typically correspond to the cusps of that tooth. It will join root pulp near that cervical region, and like we showed in those last images, that will decrease in size as we age. Radicular pulp also becomes smaller as we age, and it extends from the cervical region down to the apex of the root. The apical, foramina, and accessory canals are found at the opening of that root pulp into the periodontium, usually is centrally located right at the root apex, but can deviate as we age. And over time, accessory canals can be seen and formed on the lateral root as well as in the furcation areas of multi-rooted teeth. The accessory canals will allow the pulp to contact and communicate with periapical tissues. So that being said, if we have inflammation and infection in the pulp, it can drain through that apical, foramen, and accessory canals into the periodontium. And that's when we would see the abscess on x-rays. If you look at this is blown up microscopically. You can see that the arrows are pointing to accessory canals that are coming off of that root chamber, pulp chamber. Pulp is composed of large arteries, veins, and nerve trunks that are then surrounded by fibroblasts and collagen fibers that are embedded into that matrix. Peripherally or around the outside, odontoblasts are located right against the wall of predentin. And so the predentin, remember, is that first mineral deposit of dentin that's laid down on top of the pulp chamber. So odontogenic zone, odontoblasts are the dentin-forming cells. So in this zone, we've got a cell-free zone, which is known as the zone of Weyl or Veal. and the cell-rich zone that contains many fibroblasts. And then there's a parietal layer of nerves. In your book, there's a picture if you wanted to see this up closer. You can see the predentin, and then right under the predentin are the odontoblasts, because they're the ones that are going to make the dentin and secrete the predentin. Then there is an area that is a cell-free zone, and then the cell-rich zone underneath, and nerves under that. So that's kind of, if you blew up the inside of the pulp microscopically or with a magnifying glass, you could see this is how it's kind of laid out in there. The shape of the odontoblast depends on the location of the pulp. So they're larger in the coronal pulp than in the root. They appear columnar in pulp horns and more cuboidal in the radicular pulp. In the apical region, down towards the root tip, they're flat. Fibroblasts are the most numerous cells in the pulp because they produce collagen fibers as well as the ground substance that we see in young pulp. As we age, those fibroblasts are less active and they have fewer organelles, which pretty much happens with most of the cells in our body as we age. Some other pulpal cells that you might see are Schwann cells, which form the myelin sheath that cover the nerves. Endothelial cells will be important for the epithelium that lines the capillaries, arteries, and veins. Lymphocytes for draining of infection and keeping things cleaned, and blood vessel constituents. Collagen exists in the extracellular matrix that surrounds these cells, and there are two types of cells, or of collagen cells, found in pulp. We've got type 1 collagen, which is probably produced by odontoblast, and then the type 3 is thought to be produced by pulp fibroblasts. This collagen surrounds fibers and is the ground substance of pulp, and it is the environment that provides life for these cells that are found in the pulp. Pulp is highly vascularized. That's where all our nerves are. So if we get infection in the pulp, many times you're going to have sensitivity to hot, sweet, pressure, cold. So it is lots of nerves, blood supply, all kinds of stuff like that. The walls of the periodontal and pulpal vessels become very thin as they enter the pulp. So blood flow through the pulp is rapid and the pressure is quite high. Nerves in the pulp are non-myelinated and myelinated, and they enter through that apical canal. A mature pulp organ has a plexus of nerves that may be seen in the roof of the coronal pulp, lateral to the walls of the coronal pulp. We see less in the root canals, and these areas are called the parietal layer of nerves, or the nerve plexus of Raschkow. Most pulp nerve endings are in that odontogenic region of the pulp horns, where those odontoblasts are. Some are in predentinal tubules, usually in the pulp horns, and then some function in pain regulation. The pain and Pulp-Dentin complex. So there's a couple different theories of how pain is produced in a tooth. The direct innervation theory, they state that nerves extend to the DEJ, and studies have not shown these nerves present at this junction. So this one has not been proven. The transduction theory is the theory that the odontoblast process is the neuroreceptor and conducts pain to nerve endings in the peripheral pulp. So in the outer pulp, they believe that those processes, or those long extensions off of the odontoblast, are neuroreceptors and conduct pain to the nerve endings. The hydrodynamic theory is one that is pretty well accepted and believed. The pulpal nerves project 0.5 millimeters into the dentin, And it's thought that the changes in the fluid pressure that actually change the shape of the odontoblast, which then stimulates the nerve. The nerve is a pain receptor, so any stimulus in a tooth is presented and transmitted as pain. So here is the direct theory where you've got the nerve impulse coming in to the dentin, following through the intratubular peritubular dentin to the predentin to the odontoblast and out direct. This second image is the odontoblast acting as a receptor. You can see that the odontoblast is receiving the impulse and it's being picked up and sent to the brain. Then the last image shows fluid movement through the tubules, stimulating receptors in the pulp and causing that sensation of pain. Again, with teeth, the only perception we have is pain. So what are some of the functions of pulp? They provide vitality to the teeth, but they also are inductive, meaning that they initiate tooth formation. It's formative, it forms dentin. It is protective because it responds to stimuli. It is nutritive because it carries oxygen and nutrition for the tooth. And it is reparative because it forms reparative dentin whenever there's been trauma to the tooth, and it does that to protect that pulp. Some regressive changes that can occur with pulp are they can become more fibrotic. We can see pulp stones and some diffuse calcifications. If we look at this tooth, the image that we have here, we can see the dentinal tubule, the pulp, and where reparative dentin has been laid down where the tooth was either prepped or decayed. Those kinds of things can cause the tooth to lay down more dentin to protect the underlying pulp. So this could have been environmental stimuli or aging causing these changes in the pulp. We see those decreases in size with aging, and we, like I said, we'll see that reparative dentin being laid down in areas where we've seen trauma from, like I said, decay or from a tooth preparation. Cellular activity will decrease with time, as we mentioned before. Pulp stones are also called denticles, and you can see that in this image, we're pointing to a little pulp stone that is free floating in the coronal pulp. We can also find them attached or in the root pulp. They are actually just round oval calcified masses. A true pulp stone contains dentinal tubules, and a false pulp stone does not. They can be classified as free, like this one is just floating. They can be attached to the dentin, or they can be embedded within dentin. And here's what those might look like. We've got a false pulp stone, which means it does not have dentinal tubules. A true pulp stone, also known as a denticle, would have dentinal tubules. And you can see where there's C is free, D is embedded, and attached. So we've got free, embedded, and attached, and then there's false and true. That's based on whether they have dentinal tubules or not. Irregular calcified deposits can occur along the collagen that's found within the pulp, within those bundles, or in the blood vessels. So we can see these calcifications build up in those areas. This is more often seen in the root canal area than in the coronal area of the pulp.